The marble floors of the First National Bank of Charleston echoed with each deliberate step as Marcus Rothwell entered the grand lobby that Wednesday morning in October. At 39, he commanded attention without seeking it, tall impeccably. Dressed in a charcoal suit that cost more than most people earned in 6 months, carrying himself with the quiet authority of a man who owned half the city's commercial district. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The bank employees straightened instinctively as he passed, though Marcus barely acknowledged their presence. He wasn't rude, simply distant, a man who had learned early that emotional distance was both protection and power. His appointment with President Harrison was scheduled for 9 sharp, and Marcus Rothwell was never late. But fate, it seemed, had other plans. As he approached the bank's towering glass doors, preparing to exit after concluding his business, Marcus caught sight of something that stopped him mid-stride. There, across the busy intersection of King and Market Streets, beneath the weathered awning of an abandoned storefront, sat a woman whose presence struck him like lightning. 22 years had passed since he'd last seen Elena Vasquez, but recognition was instant and devastating. The raven-black hair that had once cascaded down her back in glossy waves now hung limp and unkempt around shoulders that seemed too fragile to bear whatever burdens life had placed upon them. The dancing brown eyes that had haunted his dreams for over 2 decades were now dulled by exhaustion and something far worse, defeat. She held a cardboard sign in hands that trembled slightly, though whether from cold or desperation, Marcus couldn't tell from this distance. The words on the sign were illegible from where he stood, but their purpose was unmistakable. Elena Vasquez, the girl who had once been his entire world, who had filled his teenage years with laughter and hope and dreams of a future they would build together, was begging on the streets of Charleston. The shock hit him with physical force, and Marcus gripped the door handle to steady himself. This couldn't be real. This couldn't be the same Elena who had graduated valedictorian from Charleston Academy, who had been accepted to Duke University on a full scholarship, who had possessed such fierce intelligence and determination that everyone who knew her predicted she would conquer whatever world she chose to enter. Yet there she was, reduced to circumstances that seemed impossible to reconcile with the brilliant, ambitious girl he remembered. Marcus stood frozen in the bank's doorway, his mind struggling to process this collision between past and present, between the life he had built in careful isolation and the one person who had ever truly mattered to him. The story of how Marcus Rothwell had become the silent baron of Charleston's business district was one of methodical ambition and ruthless self-discipline. Born Marcus Rodriguez in the working-class neighborhood of West Ashley, he had been the son of a construction worker and a seamstress who cleaned houses for wealthy families on the peninsula. His parents, Miguel and Carmen Rodriguez, had immigrated from Puerto Rico with nothing but determination and an unshakable belief that education was the only path to a better life. Marcus had inherited his father's work ethic and his mother's sharp intelligence, but it was the daily humiliations of poverty that had truly shaped him. He remembered the shame of wearing donated clothes to school, the careful way his mother counted coins before every grocery trip, the nights when his parents spoke in hushed Spanish about bills they couldn't pay and dreams they couldn't afford. At Charleston Academy, where he had earned admission through a combination of academic excellence and his mother's quiet lobbying of the wealthy family she worked for, Marcus had been an outsider in every sense. The scholarship boy among the sons and daughters of Charleston's elite, he had learned to navigate 2 worlds simultaneously: the modest apartment where his family spoke Spanish and ate rice and beans for dinner, and the marble halls where his classmates discussed summer homes in the Hamptons and European vacations as casually as others might mention the weather. It was at Charleston Academy that he had first encountered Elena Vasquez, though their initial meeting had been far from romantic. She was the daughter of Dr. Antonio Vasquez, one of Charleston's most respected physicians, and Isabella Vasquez, a former debutante whose family had lost their fortune during her childhood, but retained their social connections. Elena occupied a unique position in the school's social hierarchy, not quite wealthy enough to belong to the inner circle of true privilege, but far above the scholarship students who existed on the margins. Marcus had first noticed her during advanced literature class, where she had delivered a passionate defense of Isabel Allende's The House of the Spirits, that had left their elderly professor speechless with admiration. She possessed a rare combination of intellectual rigor and emotional depth, arguing with the kind of conviction that suggested literature wasn't just an academic subject for her, but a window into the human condition. After class, Marcus had approached her with uncharacteristic boldness, offering his own interpretation of Allende's treatment of political upheaval and family loyalty. Elena had listened with the focused attention of someone genuinely interested in ideas, then challenged his conclusions with questions that revealed she had thought far more deeply about the subject than most of their classmates. That conversation had stretched into lunch, then into an after-school walk through the historic district, then into a friendship that had gradually deepened into something neither of them had expected or entirely understood. They were 17, old enough to recognize the intensity of what they felt, but young enough to believe that love could overcome any obstacle. Elena was everything Marcus wasn't, confident where he was cautious, expressive where he was reserved, comfortable in her own skin, despite her family's modest circumstances. She drew him out of the protective shell he had built around himself, encouraging him to share his thoughts about literature and philosophy, his dreams of someday owning his own business, his complicated feelings about straddling two cultures and belonging fully to neither. In return, Marcus offered Elena something she had never experienced: complete acceptance without judgment. He loved her fierce intelligence, her compassion for others, her ability to find beauty in unexpected places. He loved the Spanish words she would whisper to him when they thought no one was listening, the way she would trace the calluses on his hands, earned from weekend construction jobs with his father, as if they were marks of honor rather than shame. Their relationship had been necessarily secret, not because either family would have objected. Dr. Vasquez had actually met Miguel Rodriguez at a community health fair and expressed admiration for his work ethic, but because the social dynamics of Charleston Academy made public relationships between scholarship students and established families complicated for everyone involved. They would meet in the school library during study periods, steal moments together in the hidden corners of Hampton Park, spend hours walking the Battery, while discussing their plans for the future. Elena was determined to study medicine like her father, with dreams of opening a clinic that would serve Charleston's underserved communities. Marcus harbored ambitions in business and real estate, driven by a desire to accumulate the kind of wealth and security that would ensure he never again felt the powerlessness of poverty. Their plans had seemed perfectly aligned. They would both attend universities in South Carolina, Elena at Duke, Marcus at USC on an academic scholarship he had fought tooth and nail to earn. They would maintain their relationship through college, then return to Charleston to build careers, and eventually a life together. They had even picked out a house, a modest but charming place in the Cannonboro neighborhood that represented the perfect compromise between Marcus's need for financial security and Elena's desire to remain connected to her community. But life, as Marcus had learned repeatedly, rarely consulted individual plans when determining its own course. The crisis that had shattered their carefully constructed future had begun with a phone call on a humid Tuesday evening in June, 2 weeks before graduation. Marcus had been working at his summer job inventory management at a downtown warehouse when his supervisor approached with the grave expression of someone delivering terrible news. "Rodriguez," the man had said, his voice heavy with sympathy. Marcus had never heard from him before. "You need to get to Charleston General Hospital. There's been an accident." The ambulance ride through Charleston's evening traffic had passed. In a blur of sirens and medical terminology Marcus didn't understand. His father, Miguel, had been working on a construction site downtown when a crane malfunction had sent a load of steel beams crashing toward the ground. Miguel had pushed two younger workers to safety, but hadn't been able to clear the area himself. The injuries were catastrophic. Multiple fractures, internal bleeding, traumatic brain injury, the kind of damage that even the best medical care might not be able to repair. Dr. Peterson, the attending physician, had explained the situation with professional compassion. Miguel Rodriguez might survive, but he would never work again. The medical bills alone would bankrupt the family, and someone would need to provide full-time care. Carmen Rodriguez had collapsed in the hospital waiting room when the full implications became clear. The insurance coverage was minimal. The disability payments would barely cover basic living expenses, and their son's college scholarship, earned through years of relentless study and sacrifice, suddenly seemed like an impossible luxury. Marcus had sat beside his mother's hospital bed that night, listening to her sob in Spanish while she apologized over and over for the dreams that were dying along with their old life. In the span of a few hours, everything had changed. College was no longer an option. His future in business would have to wait. Elena and their carefully planned life together would have to become casualties of circumstances beyond anyone's control. Conversation with Elena had been the hardest thing Marcus had ever done. They had met at their usual spot in Hampton Park, beneath the ancient oak tree where they had shared their first kiss and made so many promises about their future. Elena had known something was wrong the moment she saw his face. Marcus had never been good at hiding his emotions from her, but she hadn't been prepared for the magnitude of what he was about to tell her. "I can't go to USC," he had said without preamble, unable to bear the thought of prolonging her pain with elaborate explanations. "I can't leave Charleston. Everything has changed." Elena had listened in stunned silence as he explained about his father's accident, the financial catastrophe that had befallen his family, the impossible choice between his own dreams and his obligations as a son. She had argued, of course had suggested they find another way, proposed that she defer her own admission to Duke for a year while they figured out alternatives, even offered to speak to her father about possible medical solutions that might reduce the family's burden. But Marcus had already made his decision, and it wasn't one that allowed for compromise or delay. He would stay in Charleston, find whatever work he could to support his parents, and release Elena from promises that no longer made sense given their new reality. "This isn't about money," Elena had said, her voice breaking with frustration and grief. "This is about us giving up on each other when we should be fighting together." "Fighting with what?" Marcus had replied, his own heart breaking with every word. "Fighting with dreams that don't fit our reality. Fighting with hopes that will only make the next 20 years more painful. Elena, I love you enough to want you to have the life you deserve, even if I can't be part of it." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The argument that had followed would haunt them both for decades. Elena had accused him of making decisions for both of them without considering what she might be willing to sacrifice for their relationship. Marcus had insisted that asking her to give up Duke and her medical career would be selfish beyond forgiveness. They had been too young to understand that sometimes love requires accepting help, and too proud to recognize that strength isn't always found in solitary struggle. Their final goodbye had taken place on the steps of Charleston Academy during graduation rehearsal. Elena had made one last plea for them to find a way forward together, her brown eyes bright with tears she refused to shed in public. Marcus had responded with the kind of emotional distance he had learned as armor against disappointment, telling her that their relationship had been a beautiful chapter in their adolescence, but that adult responsibilities required adult choices. "If you walk away from us now, Elena had said, her voice steady despite the devastation in her eyes. Don't come looking for me in 5 years when your life is easier. Don't expect me to wait for someone who was too afraid to fight for what we had. Marcus had nodded, accepting the finality of her words, even as they cut deeper than any physical wound he had ever experienced. He had watched her walk away, her back straight with the dignity that had always been one of her most beautiful qualities, and had known he was losing the only person who had ever seen past his defenses to the man he might have become. That had been 22 years ago. 22 years during which Marcus had built exactly the kind of success he had once dreamed of, transforming himself from Marcus Rodriguez, the scholarship boy from West Ashley, into Marcus Rothwell, the silent baron of Charleston's commercial district. The name change had come gradually, first a professional anglicization to make networking easier, then a legal transformation that had allowed him to leave his painful past behind entirely. He had accumulated wealth through a combination of shrewd real estate investments, strategic business acquisitions, and the kind of patient long-term planning that his competitors often underestimated. By 35, he owned more commercial property in downtown Charleston than any other individual investor. By 38, his net worth had reached 8 figures, and his influence extended into banking, development, and city planning. But success had come at a price that Marcus was only beginning to understand as he stood in the bank's doorway, staring across the street at the woman who had once known him better than anyone else in the world. The emotional distance that had protected him through years of struggle had gradually hardened into genuine isolation. He lived alone in a mansion on South Battery that could have housed 3 families comfortably. He worked alone in an office that occupied an entire floor of Charleston's newest high-rise. He moved through Charleston's social and business circles with polite efficiency but genuine warmth for no one. The few people who might have called themselves his friends were really business associates who appreciated his reliability and discretion. The women who had attempted to court his attention over the years had been attracted to his wealth and status, but had quickly discovered that Marcus Rothwell was fundamentally unavailable in ways that had nothing to do with scheduling conflicts or professional obligations. He had become exactly what his teenage self had both feared and aspired to, a man of enormous influence and complete isolation, surrounded by luxury but untouched by genuine human connection. The boy who had fallen in love with Elena Vasquez had been curious about the world, passionate about ideas, capable of joy and spontaneous laughter. The man who stared at her now across a busy Charleston intersection had learned to value control above all else, had traded emotional vulnerability for financial security, had chosen power over love so completely that he had almost forgotten. The difference, not almost, but not quite. Because seeing Elena again broken, desperate, reduced to circumstances that seemed to mock everything she had once been, had cracked something in Marcus that 22 years of careful emotional management had failed to protect. The sight of her stirred feelings he had thought safely buried reminded him of dreams he had convinced himself were childish fantasies, forced him to confront the possibility that his carefully constructed life might be nothing more than an elaborate form of hiding. As he watched Elena shift slightly on whatever makeshift seat she had found, Marcus noticed details that spoke to desperation more profound than simple poverty. Her clothes, though clean, were worn thin and carefully mended. Her shoes had been resoled multiple times and still showed signs of frequent walking. Most telling of all was the way she held herself, shoulders curved inward as if trying to take up less space in the world, eyes focused on the ground to avoid the judgment of passers-by. This was not the Elena who had stood before their advanced literature class and defended her interpretation of Allende with passionate conviction. This was not the girl who had challenged him to think more deeply about everything from social justice to the meaning of success. This was someone who had been systematically diminished by circumstances Marcus couldn't begin to imagine, reduced to seeking charity from strangers on a street corner in the city, where she had once been destined for greatness. The realization hit him with stunning clarity. While he had been building his empire of isolation, acquiring wealth and influence and all the trappings of conventional success, Elena had been fighting battles he had never bothered to consider. While he had been transforming himself from Marcus Rodriguez into Marcus Rothwell, carefully erasing every trace of the boy who had once been vulnerable enough to love completely, she had been living a life that had brought her to this moment of public desperation. And in that instant of recognition, Marcus understood that everything he had built, every carefully calculated investment, every strategic relationship, every decision made in service of his own security had led him to this moment when he would finally discover what kind of man he had truly become. The decision to cross the street required more courage than any business deal Marcus had ever negotiated. Each step toward Elena felt like walking backward through time, stripping away layers of carefully constructed identity until he was once again 17 years old and terrified of not being enough for the girl he loved. The morning traffic of Charleston seemed to part around him as he made his way across King Street, his expensive Italian leather shoes clicking against asphalt that separated two versions of his life. With each step, Marcus felt the weight of 22 years of careful emotional distance beginning to crack under the pressure of proximity to the one person who had ever seen him as simply Marcus, not as a collection of achievements and acquisitions. Elena didn't notice his approach initially. Her attention was focused on the cardboard sign in her lap, which Marcus could now see read, "Anything helps. God bless." The words were written in careful block letters, the kind of penmanship that spoke to someone who had once taken pride in presentation, but was now reduced to its most basic necessity. When she finally looked up, the recognition that passed between them was like watching lightning strike the same place twice. Elena's brown eyes widened with a complex mixture of shock, shame, and something that might have been hope, quickly followed by a defensive wariness that suggested she had learned to expect disappointment from every quarter. Marcus? The name escaped her lips as barely more than a whisper, carrying within it decades of unspoken questions and carefully buried emotions. "Is it really you?" The sound of his name in her voice, not the businesslike Mr. Rothwell he heard dozens of times each day, but the intimate Marcus that no one had spoken with genuine affection in more years than he cared to count, nearly undid him completely. "Hello, Elena." The words felt inadequate to bridge the chasm between who they had been and who they had become, but they were all he could manage without his voice betraying the emotional earthquake occurring beneath his composed exterior. For a moment, they simply stared at each other, two people who had once shared everything, now strangers shaped by experiences the other knew nothing about. Elena's face showed the toll of whatever journey had brought her to the street corner, fine lines around her eyes that spoke of worry and sleepless nights, a hollowness in her cheeks that suggested meals too often skipped, hands that bore the roughness of work that had nothing to do with the medical career she had once planned. But beneath the evidence of hardship, Marcus could still see traces of the girl who had captured his heart at Charleston Academy. The intelligence in her eyes remained undimmed. The set of her chin still suggested the stubborn dignity that had always been one of her most beautiful qualities, and when she unconsciously tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, gesture he remembered from 1,000 teenage conversations, the motion was so familiar it took his breath away. "I heard you had done well for yourself," Elena said finally, her voice carefully modulated to reveal nothing of what she might be feeling. "Marcus Rothwell, isn't it now? The newspapers call you the Silent Baron." There was no accusation in her tone, but no warmth either, simply the careful politeness of someone who had learned to navigate difficult conversations with strangers. The reference to his changed name and public reputation felt like a physical blow. Of course Elena would know about his success. His business dealings were regularly covered in the Charleston Post and Courier. and his donations to various civic causes had earned him recognition throughout the city. But hearing her acknowledge the distance between Marcus Rodriguez, the boy she had loved, and Marcus Rothwell, the man he had become, forced him to confront just how completely he had reinvented himself. Yes, he admitted, though the simple word felt like a confession of betrayal. A lot has changed. Elena's laugh held no humor. Yes, it has. She gestured at her current circumstances with a self-deprecating wave that somehow managed to maintain dignity, even in the midst of obvious desperation. I suppose neither of us ended up where we thought we would. The conversation that followed was perhaps the most difficult Marcus had ever navigated, requiring him to balance genuine concern with respect for Elena's pride, curiosity about her circumstances with sensitivity to her obvious embarrassment, and his own emotional turmoil with the kind of practical thinking that had made him successful in business. In carefully measured exchanges, the outlines of Elena's story began to emerge. She had indeed attended Duke University as planned, graduating summa cum laude with a degree in pre-medicine. But medical school had proven financially impossible when her father's practice had been devastated by a malpractice lawsuit that had consumed the family's savings and forced them to mortgage their home. Instead of medicine, Elena had pursued a master's degree in public health, eventually finding work with a nonprofit organization that provided healthcare services to underserved communities throughout South Carolina. The work had been fulfilling but poorly paid, and Elena had supplemented her income by tutoring high school students and working part-time at a community clinic. Everything had changed 3 years earlier when Elena had married David Chun, a fellow nonprofit worker whose passion for social justice had matched her own commitment to helping others. Their shared idealism had made them a formidable team professionally, and their partnership had blossomed into a love that Elena described with the kind of quiet contentment that Marcus recognized as genuine happiness. But idealism, as Elena had discovered, was no protection against tragedy. David had been killed in a car accident while driving home from a late-night emergency at one of their clinics, leaving Elena not only devastated by grief but also responsible for medical bills and funeral expenses that had quickly consumed their modest savings. The nonprofit where they had both worked had been sympathetic but unable to provide more than temporary assistance. Without David's income and facing mounting debts, Elena had been forced to move from their small apartment into progressively cheaper accommodations until she found herself living in a weekly rate motel on the outskirts of Charleston. Her work history in the nonprofit sector, while personally meaningful, had not provided her with the kind of marketable skills that translated easily to higher-paying employment. The few interviews she had managed to secure had ended with polite rejections that suggested her qualifications were either insufficient for professional positions or overqualified for service jobs that might have provided immediate income. Final blow had come when the motel where she was staying had raised its weekly rates beyond what she could afford. With nowhere else to turn and no family members in a position to help, her parents had died within a year of each other during her marriage, and she had no siblings. Elena had found herself quite literally on the street. "I know how this looks," she said, her voice steady despite the obvious humiliation of having to explain her circumstances to someone who represented everything she had once hoped to achieve. "I know what people think when they see someone begging. That we're lazy or addicted or somehow deserving of our situation. But Marcus, I have applied for over 200 jobs in the past 6 months. I have knocked on doors, sent resumes, filled out applications until my hands cramped. And every morning I wake up trying to figure out how to make it through another day." The raw honesty of her explanation cut through Marcus like a blade. This was not the story of someone who had made poor choices or failed to work hard enough. This was the story of someone who had been systematically crushed by circumstances beyond her control, who had discovered that good intentions and strong work ethic were sometimes insufficient armor against the random cruelties of life. As Elena spoke, Marcus found himself studying her face with the intensity of someone trying to memorize something precious before it disappeared forever. The bone structure was the same, the way her eyebrows drew together when she was thinking seriously, the slight tilt of her head when she was choosing her words carefully. But there was a weariness in her expression that spoke to battles fought. Alone, a kind of exhaustion that sleep could not cure. "How long have you been ... Marcus gestured at the cardboard sign, unable to complete the sentence. 3 weeks, Elena replied with the matter-of-fact tone of someone who had learned to discuss the undiscussable. "I tried everything else first. Food banks, temporary shelters, churches, social services. But there are waiting lists for everything. And most of the assistance programs require an address I don't have. So this is what's left. 3 weeks. The number hit Marcus with unexpected force. While he had been negotiating million-dollar real estate deals and attending charity galas, where the wine cost more than most people spent on groceries, Elena had been spending 3 weeks begging for survival on the streets of their hometown. "Where are you staying?" The question escaped before he could consider whether it was appropriate to ask. Elena's hesitation told him everything he needed to know before she answered. "I found some safe places. The bus station stays open all night. And there's a 24-hour laundromat where they don't mind if you sit for a while. The weather's been mild, so." She trailed off, perhaps recognizing that her attempt to minimize her situation was not entirely convincing. Marcus felt something crack inside his chest, not just sympathy, but a kind of rage at the universe that had allowed someone like Elena to fall so far while elevating someone like him to heights he had never really deserved. The arbitrary nature of their reversed fortunes seemed not just unfair but actively malicious, as if fate had deliberately chosen to punish the person who had dedicated her life to helping others, while rewarding the one who had spent decades in careful isolation. "Elena," he said, his voice carrying a weight of decision he hadn't realized he was making. "Let me help you." The words hung in the air between them like a bridge neither was sure could bear the weight of crossing. Elena's immediate response was to shake her head with the kind of fierce independence that Marcus remembered from their teenage years. "I'm not asking for charity, Marcus. I just need to find work, a real job that will let me get back on my feet. I don't want handouts." "It wouldn't be charity," Marcus replied, though he wasn't entirely sure what it would be. "It would be..." He paused, searching for words that wouldn't insult her pride while still offering genuine assistance. "It would be one old friend helping another." But even as he spoke, Marcus knew the situation was far more complicated than simple friendship. The feelings that seeing Elena again had awakened in him were not the nostalgic affection of someone remembering a pleasant chapter from his youth. They were the deep, fundamental emotions of someone confronting the road not taken, the life he might have lived if he had possessed more courage 22 years earlier. Elena seemed to sense the complexity of what he was offering, because her response carried its own weight of unspoken implications. "Marcus, you don't understand what you're saying. I'm not the girl you used to know. These past few years have changed me in ways that can't be undone by simply getting back on my feet financially. I've learned things about the world, about myself, that I can't unlearn." "What kind of things?" Elena was quiet for a long moment, her gaze moving past Marcus to the steady stream of Charleston pedestrians who walked by without acknowledging her existence. "I've learned that dignity is a luxury most people can't afford. I've learned that there's a point where pride becomes an obstacle to survival. I've learned that the difference between having a home and sleeping on the street can be as small as a single unexpected expense, and that the safety net everyone assumes exists is full of holes large enough for entire lives to fall through." She looked back at Marcus with eyes that held a depth of knowledge he had never acquired, despite all his business success. "I've learned that people like you, successful people with options, look right through people like me as if we don't exist. And I've learned that sometimes the only difference between us and them is luck. The observation stung because it contained an uncomfortable truth. How many times had Marcus walked past someone in Elena's situation without really seeing them? How many people had he dismissed as lazy or irresponsible without considering the complex circumstances that might have led to their desperation? How many Elena Vasquezes had he ignored because acknowledging their existence would have forced him to confront uncomfortable questions about the arbitrary nature of success and failure? "You're right," he admitted, the words coming easier than he had expected. "I have been blind to things I should have seen. But Elena, seeing you here, it's opened my eyes to realities I've been avoiding for years. Let me do something meaningful with the resources I've accumulated. Let me use what I have to make a difference in your life." Elena studied his face with the intensity of someone trying to solve a complex equation. "And what would you want in return?" The question was fair but painful, implying as it did that Elena had learned to expect ulterior motives from every offer of assistance. Marcus realized that his wealth and success, rather than making him more trustworthy, had actually made him suspect another powerful man whose generosity might come with strings attached. "Nothing," he said, though the word felt insufficient to capture the complexity of his motivations. "I want nothing in return except the knowledge that I've done something worthwhile with advantages I never really earned." It was a partial truth. Because Marcus did want something in return, he wanted the chance to discover who he might have been if he had chosen differently all those years ago. Wanted to explore whether the connection they had once shared could be rebuilt into something meaningful for the people they had become. Wanted to find out if love deferred could become love renewed under the right circumstances. But those desires felt too selfish to voice, too presumptuous to even acknowledge fully to himself. Elena was fighting for survival. She didn't need the additional burden of managing his romantic nostalgia or emotional awakening. "I need to think about it," Elena said finally. This is not a decision I can make sitting on a street corner with people watching us." Marcus nodded, understanding that Elena needed space to process not just his offer, but the emotional shock of their unexpected reunion. "Of course, but Elena ... He reached into his jacket and withdrew a business card, then stopped himself. A business card seemed absurdly formal given the circumstances. Instead, he pulled a pen from his pocket and wrote his personal cell phone number on the back of his bank receipt. "This is my direct number. Day or night, whenever you're ready to talk." "And Elena?" He paused, meeting her eyes with an intensity that carried 22 years of unspoken regret. "Whatever you decide about my help, I'm glad I found you again. I'm glad to know you're alive and fighting. That matters more than you might realize." Elena took the paper with hands that trembled slightly. Though whether from emotion or simple physical exhaustion, Marcus couldn't tell. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for seeing me, for stopping, for remembering who we used to be to each other." As Marcus walked away, he could feel Elena's eyes following him until he disappeared around the corner onto Market Street. The brief encounter had lasted less than 30 minutes, but it had accomplished what 22 years of business success had failed to achieve. It had reminded him that Marcus Rodriguez still existed somewhere beneath the careful construction of Marcus Rothwell, and that the boy who had once loved Elena Vasquez completely might still be capable of the kind of courage that mattered. The question now was whether Elena would give him the chance to find out. The phone call came at 2:47 a.m. on a Thursday night, 3 days after Marcus had given Elena his number. The shrill ring cut through the silence of his mansion on South Battery like an alarm, jolting him from the first deep sleep he'd managed since their encounter. His bedside clock cast pale blue numbers across the darkness as he fumbled for the phone, heart pounding with the kind of adrenaline that comes from unexpected contact in the small hours. "Marcus?" Elena's voice was barely above a whisper, strained with something that sounded like pain. "I'm sorry to call so late, but I didn't know who else. I need help." He was fully awake instantly, swinging his legs out of bed and reaching for the clothes he'd left folded on his chair, a habit from childhood when emergencies meant quick departures and no time for careful preparation. "Where are you? What's wrong?" "I'm at Charleston General Hospital." Her voice wavered, and Marcus could hear the fluorescent hum of institutional lighting in the background. "There was an incident tonight. Some men. They thought I had money hidden somewhere. When they realized I didn't, they ... She paused, and Marcus heard her take a shaky breath. "The doctor says I have a concussion and some cracked ribs. They want to keep me for observation, but I don't have insurance. I don't have anything." Marcus was already moving, pulling on his clothes with one hand while keeping the phone pressed to his ear. "I'm coming. Don't worry about the money. I'll handle everything. Just stay where you are." "Marcus, I can't ask you to. You're not asking, I'm offering. There's a difference." His voice carried the kind of authority that had closed million-dollar deals, but underneath it was something Elena might have recognized from their teenage years, the fierce protectiveness he'd always felt toward the people he cared about. "What room are you in?" The drive to Charleston General took 12 minutes through empty streets that reflected his headlights like black mirrors. Marcus had made this journey once before, 22 years earlier, when his father had been brought here after the construction accident. Then, he had been a terrified teenager with $17 in his pocket and no idea how to navigate the complex machinery of medical care and insurance claims. Now he was a man with resources and influence, but the antiseptic smell of the hospital corridor still triggered memories of helplessness and fear. Elena was in room 314, a semi-private space she shared with an elderly woman who snored softly behind a curtain partition. She looked smaller than she had on the street corner, somehow diminished by the hospital gown and the various monitoring equipment that surrounded her bed. A bandage covered the left side of her forehead, and Marcus could see the beginning of what would become spectacular bruising around her left eye. But it was the expression in her uninjured eye that hit him hardest, not just physical pain, but a kind of spiritual exhaustion that suggested this assault had been the final straw in a series of indignities that had pushed her beyond her breaking point. "Thank you for coming," she said as he settled into the uncomfortable plastic chair beside her bed. "I know this isn't what you signed up for when you gave me your number." Marcus studied her face, noting details the harsh hospital lighting revealed. The way she held her left arm protectively against her ribs, the careful, shallow breathing that suggested every inhalation caused pain, the tremor in her hands that spoke to more than just physical trauma. "Tell me what happened." Elena's account came in careful, measured sentences, as if she were testifying in court rather than confiding in someone who had once known her better than anyone else in the world. She had been settling down for the night in a doorway behind a closed restaurant on Upper King Street, a spot she had thought was relatively safe because it was out of sight from the main road, but still within earshot of passing pedestrians. 3 men had approached her around midnight, initially seeming friendly. They had offered her a cigarette, asked how long she'd been on the street, shown what appeared to be genuine concern for her welfare. But their demeanor had changed quickly. When they began questioning her about money, insisting that someone who spoke as well as she did and carried herself with obvious education must be hiding resources, when Elena had tried to explain that she truly had nothing beyond the few dollars in her pocket money she had earned earlier that day, the men had become increasingly aggressive. They had searched through her meager possessions, growing more violent when they found nothing of value. The assault had ended only when a late-night delivery truck had turned into the alley, startling the attackers into fleeing. The driver called the ambulance, Elena concluded. He stayed with me until they arrived. Said his name was Tommy Martinez, and that he had a sister who'd been homeless for a while. He understood. Marcus felt anger building in his chest, not just at the men who had hurt Elena, but at a system that had allowed someone with her intelligence and compassion to become vulnerable to such predation. Elena Vasquez, who had once tutored struggling students for free and volunteered at community health fairs, who had dedicated her adult life to helping others, had been beaten by strangers who assumed her desperation was a performance concealing hidden wealth. Did you report it to the police? Elena's laugh was bitter. What would be the point? 3 homeless-looking men assaulted another homeless person in an alley behind a restaurant. Even if they could find the attackers, what prosecutor is going to prioritize that case? What jury is going to care? Her cynicism was heartbreaking because it was probably accurate. Marcus had enough experience with Charleston's legal system to know that crimes against society's most vulnerable members rarely received the attention they deserved, especially when the victims couldn't afford private attorneys or had no permanent address to ensure their availability for testimony. The doctor wants to discharge me in the morning, Elena continued. But Marcus, I can't go back out there, not like this. I can barely walk without help, and these ribs. If someone hits me, again in the same place. She didn't finish the sentence, but the implication was clear. Marcus had been formulating a plan since the moment Elena had called. But hearing her acknowledge her vulnerability crystallized his determination into action. You're not going back out there. I have a guest house on my property that's been empty for months. You can stay there while you recover. Elena's response was immediate and predictable. Marcus, I can't accept that kind of help. A place to stay, utilities, security, that's not assistance, that's charity. That's you providing for someone who can't provide for themselves. Then we'll make it not charity. Marcus had spent 3 days thinking about this conversation, anticipating Elena's objections and formulating responses that might preserve her dignity while still providing the help she desperately needed. You said you've been looking for work. I'll hire you. To do what? Marcus, I appreciate what you're trying to do, but I'm not going to accept a made-up job just so you can feel better about helping me. Marcus leaned forward in his chair, meeting her skeptical gaze with steady determination. It wouldn't be made up. Elena, I own 17 different businesses in Charleston, from retail properties to restaurant franchises to service companies. I've been looking for someone to oversee community outreach and social responsibility initiatives across all of them. Someone who understands both business operations and nonprofit work, who can identify opportunities for meaningful community engagement rather than just publicity stunts. He could see Elena processing this information, her sharp mind working, to determine whether his offer was genuine or an elaborate fiction designed to make charity palatable. The position would involve developing partnerships with local nonprofits, creating employee volunteer programs, establishing scholarship funds, identifying ways for profitable businesses to have positive community impact. It's exactly the kind of work you've been doing, just with better resources and broader reach. Elena was quiet for several minutes, and Marcus could almost see her weighing her options. Accept his help and risk becoming dependent on someone whose motivation she couldn't entirely trust, or refuse and return to circumstances that had nearly gotten her killed. What would the salary be? She asked finally. Marcus had anticipated this question too. He needed to offer enough to allow Elena genuine independence without making the amount so large that it seemed obviously fabricated. $60,000 to start, plus health insurance and housing allowance. Standard benefits package, 2 weeks paid vacation, opportunity for advancement based on performance. It was a real salary for real work, more than Elena had been making in the nonprofit sector, but not so extravagant as to seem insulting. More importantly, it was the kind of position that would allow her to use her education and experience meaningfully while rebuilding her financial security. And the housing allowance would cover the guest house. The guest house comes with the position. Community outreach requires someone who's available for evening events and weekend activities. Having you on the property makes sense from a business perspective. Elena studied his face with the intensity of someone trying to solve a complex puzzle. Marcus, are you offering me this job because you think I'm qualified for it, or because you want to rescue the girl you used to love? The question cut straight to the heart of Marcus's motivations, forcing him to confront truths he'd been avoiding since their reunion 3 days earlier. His feelings for Elena were undoubtedly influencing his desire to help her, but that didn't make the job offer disingenuous or the work any less real. Both, he admitted. Yes, seeing you again has awakened feelings I thought I'd buried. Yes, I want to help you because of who you are to me. But Elena, I wouldn't offer you work you couldn't do well, and I wouldn't create a position that didn't serve a genuine business need. My company should be doing more community engagement. I should be using my resources to make a positive difference beyond just writing checks to established charities. He paused, choosing his next words carefully. You asked me 3 days ago what I wanted in return for helping you. Here's the honest answer. I want the chance to find out who we might become as the people we are now. I want to discover whether what we had 22 years ago was just teenage infatuation or something deeper that could grow into something meaningful between adults who've lived through loss and learned what really matters. Elena's expression softened slightly, and Marcus caught a glimpse of the girl who had once trusted him completely. And if it doesn't? If we try to rebuild something and discover that too much time has passed, too much has changed, then you'll still have a job you're good at, a place to live, and the resources to build whatever life you want for yourself. My romantic hopes don't come with strings attached to your professional security. The conversation was interrupted by a nurse making rounds, checking Elena's vital signs and adjusting her medication. The brief interlude gave both of them time to process what had been said and what decisions needed to be made. When they were alone again, Elena spoke with the careful precision of someone making a choice that would determine the entire course of her future. I'll accept the job. But Marcus, I need you to understand something. I'm not the same person you knew at Charleston Academy. These past few years have changed me in fundamental ways. I've learned to be suspicious of kindness, to question every offer of help, to protect myself first because no one else will. She shifted slightly in the hospital bed, wincing as the movement aggravated her injured ribs. I don't know if I'm still capable of the kind of trust and openness that real relationships require. I don't know if I can be vulnerable with someone who has so much power over my security. And I don't know if you can love the woman I've become as much as you remember loving the girl I used to be. Marcus reached out and gently took her uninjured hand, noting how small it felt in his own. Then we'll find out together. No expectations, no pressure, no predetermined outcomes. Just two people who care about each other, trying to build something honest and real. Elena's smile was the first genuine expression of happiness Marcus had seen from her since their reunion. It transformed her face despite the bruises and bandages, reminding him powerfully of the girl who had once made him believe that anything was possible if they faced it together. All right, she said quietly. Let's see what happens next. Outside the hospital window, Charleston was beginning to wake up to another day of possibilities and challenges. For Marcus and Elena, everything was about to change in ways neither could fully anticipate. But for the first time in decades, both were ready to embrace the uncertainty of a future they would face together. The guest house sat nestled among the ancient live oaks behind Marcus's mansion, a charming 2-bedroom cottage that had been built in the 1920s as quarters for the estate's original caretaker. Marcus had renovated it 5 years earlier with the vague intention of housing visiting business associates, but it had remained empty since completion, another beautiful space in his collection of beautiful spaces that served no real purpose. Beyond demonstrating his success, as Elena stood in the doorway on that first morning after her hospital discharge, Marcus watched her face carefully for any reaction that might give him insight into what she was feeling. The cottage was modest by his standards, but luxurious compared to the doorways and bus stations where she had been sleeping. Hardwood floors gleamed in the morning sunlight, built-in bookshelves lined the walls, and French doors opened onto a small garden that had been professionally maintained despite having no one to appreciate it. "It's beautiful," Elena said quietly, her voice carrying a note of something that might have been grief. David would have loved this place. He always said his dream was to have a little house with a garden where he could grow vegetables and read books on Sunday afternoons. It was the first time she had mentioned her late husband since their initial conversation, and Marcus felt an unexpected stab of something that was part sympathy and part jealousy. Elena had loved David Chun, had built a life with him, had shared dreams and plans that had nothing to do with teenage romance or second chances. Marcus was offering her shelter and employment, but he was also asking her to move forward from grief that was still raw and immediate. "Would you like me to show you around, or would you prefer to explore on your own?" Marcus asked, recognizing that Elena might need space to process not just the physical transition, but the emotional complexity of accepting help from someone who represented both salvation and complication. "Show me," Elena replied. "If I'm going to be working for you, I should understand what you've built here." The tour of the main house revealed the extent of Marcus's isolation in ways that no financial statement could have captured. Room after room showcased exquisite taste and unlimited resources: imported marble, handcrafted furniture, original artwork, but everything felt sterile, untouched, more like a museum display than a home where someone actually lived. The kitchen was a masterpiece of stainless steel and granite that looked as if it had never been used for anything more complex than reheating takeout containers. The dining room featured a table that could seat 12 beneath a crystal chandelier that probably cost more than most people's cars. But the table was set for one with formal china that suggested Marcus ate most of his meals alone in careful ceremony. Most telling was the library, a 2-story room with sliding ladders and floor-to-ceiling shelves, filled with leather-bound volumes that had been selected more for their visual impact than their content. Elena pulled a few books from the shelves at random, discovering that most were expensive editions of classics that showed no signs of having been read. "You used to love books," she observed, running her fingers along the spine of an pristine first edition of The Great Gatsby. "You'd quote entire passages from memory, especially the poetry. Remember how you used to recite Pablo Neruda to me in Spanish?" Marcus felt heat rise in his cheeks at the memory. He had been so eager to impress Elena with his bilingual abilities and his appreciation for literature that he had memorized dozens of poems, practicing the pronunciation until he could deliver them with what he hoped was sophisticated flair. The boy who had done that seemed like a stranger to the man who now owned hundreds of books he had never opened. "I remember," he admitted. "I suppose I stopped reading for pleasure somewhere along the way. Business journals, financial reports, legal documents, those became my literature." Elena replaced the book carefully, but Marcus caught the expression that flickered across her face. It was a pity, he realized, and somehow that was worse than anger or disappointment. She felt sorry for the man he had become, sorry that success had cost him the simple joy of losing himself in a good story. The rest of the house tour continued in relative silence, both of them processing their own thoughts about what they were seeing and what it revealed. Marcus's bedroom was enormous but impersonal. His office was impressive but cold. His entertainment areas were designed for hosting parties he never threw. Every room told the same story. A man who had accumulated everything he thought he wanted and discovered it wasn't enough to fill the spaces where authentic human connection should have been. They ended the tour in Marcus's actual office, not the formal space in his downtown building, but the smaller room where he conducted personal business and made the decisions that affected his private life. This room was different from the others, more lived in, with stacks of papers on the desk and coffee rings on the furniture that suggested genuine use. Elena studied the wall of photographs that chronicled Marcus's business achievements, groundbreaking ceremonies, ribbon cuttings, awards presentations, handshakes with mayors and governors. But Marcus noticed her attention focused on a single frame tucked almost out of sight behind his computer monitor. "Is that us?" she asked, moving closer to examine the photograph. It was their senior prom picture from Charleston Academy, taken in the school gymnasium beneath decorations that had seemed impossibly elegant to their teenage eyes, but probably looked ridiculous to an adult perspective. Marcus wore a rented tuxedo that was slightly too large, while Elena glowed in a pale blue dress her mother had sewn specifically for the occasion. They looked absurdly young and heartbreakingly happy, two kids who believed that love was all they needed to conquer whatever challenges the world might throw at them. "You kept this up all these years?" Elena's voice carried a complex mixture of surprise and something that might have been tenderness. Marcus felt exposed, as if she had discovered a diary filled with embarrassing adolescent confessions. "I know it's probably pathetic, but I couldn't bring myself to throw it away. It was the only photograph I had of the happiest night of my teenage years." Elena studied the image more closely, and Marcus wondered what she was seeing. The boy in the photograph bore little resemblance to the man he had become. Marcus Rodriguez had been all enthusiasm and hope, ready to take on the world with nothing but determination and the certainty that Elena would be beside him for whatever came next. "We look so sure of ourselves," Elena murmured. "So certain that we knew what the future would bring. Would you change anything if you could go back?" The question escaped before Marcus could consider whether he really wanted to know the answer. Elena was quiet for a long moment, her finger tracing the edge of the photograph frame. "I used to think I would. I used to lie awake at night imagining what our lives would have been like if your father hadn't gotten hurt, if we had gone to college together, if we had gotten married and built the life we planned." She turned to face him, and Marcus saw in her eyes the kind of wisdom that came from surviving genuine loss. "But Marcus, if we had stayed together, I would never have met David. I would never have experienced the kind of love that comes from choosing someone as an adult rather than falling for them as a teenager. I would never have learned that I was strong enough to survive losing someone I thought I couldn't live without." The words stung, but Marcus recognized their truth. The Elena he had loved at 17 had been wonderful, but she had also been untested by real adversity. The woman standing in his office had been shaped by experiences that included both profound joy and devastating loss, and those experiences had made her more complex, more resilient, more genuinely beautiful than the girl in the photograph. "I'm not the same person either," Marcus admitted. "Success taught me things about myself that I'm not particularly proud of. I learned that money can insulate you from almost everything except loneliness. I learned that power over others isn't the same as power over your own happiness. I learned that you can win every negotiation and still lose everything that matters." Elena nodded, seemingly unsurprised by his confession. "So where does that leave us now? Two people who've learned hard lessons trying to figure out if they can build something new from the pieces of what they used to be." It was perhaps the most honest question either had asked since their reunion, and it deserved an equally honest answer. Marcus had been avoiding this conversation because he wasn't sure he was ready to hear Elena's assessment of their possibilities, but her directness demanded reciprocal courage. "I think it leaves us exactly where we should be," he said finally. "Old enough to know that love isn't just about feelings, wise enough to recognize that compatibility requires more than shared history, experienced enough to understand that building something real takes time and patience and genuine friendship." Elena smiled, and for the first time since her return to his life, Marcus saw in her expression something that looked like genuine optimism. "That sounds like a reasonable place to start." The first week of Elena's employment revealed both the potential and the challenges of their new arrangement. Professionally, she exceeded even Marcus's optimistic expectations. Her experience in the nonprofit sector had given her insights into community needs that Marcus's business education had never addressed. and her ability to identify genuine opportunities for social impact impressed even his most cynical department heads. Within days, she had developed preliminary proposals for employee volunteer programs at his restaurants, scholarship initiatives through his retail properties, and partnership opportunities with local nonprofits that could benefit from corporate sponsorship, while providing his businesses with meaningful community connections. But the personal aspects of their relationship proved more complicated to navigate. They were living on the same property, working towards shared professional goals, and rediscovering their compatibility as intellectual partners and friends. Yet both were acutely aware of the romantic undercurrents that complicated every interaction, the unspoken questions about what they were building and where it might lead. Marcus found himself studying Elena during their business meetings, noting how she tucked her hair behind her ear when she was thinking hard about a problem, remembering how that same gesture had charmed him 22 years earlier. He caught himself offering to bring her coffee, not because she had asked, but because he wanted excuses to check on her welfare, to demonstrate care in small, acceptable ways. Elena, for her part, seemed determined to maintain professional boundaries, while allowing glimpses of the warmth that had once made Marcus feel like the most important person in her world. She would share stories about her nonprofit work or memories of David that revealed her capacity for deep emotional connection. But she was careful not to create intimacy that might complicate their working relationship. The tension came to a head on a Friday evening when Marcus found Elena in the cottage garden, sitting on the small bench he had installed beneath the climbing roses. She had changed from her professional attire into jeans and a simple sweater, and she looked younger, more relaxed than he had seen her since their reunion. "Long day?" he asked, settling onto the bench beside her with the careful distance of someone respecting boundaries. "Good day, actually," Elena replied. "I had lunch with Sarah Henderson from the Children's Crisis Center. She's excited about the partnership possibilities we discussed. Your restaurant locations could serve as collection points for their holiday toy drive, and she thinks some of your employees might be interested in volunteer mentoring." Marcus nodded, genuinely pleased by her progress, but more interested in the contentment he heard in her voice. "You sound happy, more like yourself than you have since ... since you found me begging on King Street." Elena's tone was matter-of-fact, rather than bitter. "Marcus, I need to tell you something, and I need you to listen without trying to fix it or minimize it." Marcus felt his stomach tighten with apprehension, but he nodded for her to continue. "I still wake up some nights in a panic, thinking I'm back on the street. I still check my bank balance obsessively, terrified that this security will disappear as quickly as it came. I still flinch when men approach me unexpectedly, because part of me is always waiting for another attack." She turned to face him fully, her brown eyes serious but not despondent. "What I'm trying to say is that healing from trauma takes time, longer than either of us probably expected. And while I'm grateful for everything you've done, while I'm enjoying our work together, and genuinely happy to have you back in my life, I can't promise you the kind of emotional availability that a romantic relationship would require." Marcus felt disappointment settle in his chest, but it was tempered by respect for Elena's self-awareness and honesty. "Are you saying never, or are you saying not yet?" Elena's smile was gentle but complicated. "I'm saying that I need more time to remember who I am when I'm not afraid, more time to build confidence in my own strength, more time to trust that good things can happen without being taken away. Can you be patient with that process, even if it takes longer than you hoped?" Marcus reached out and took her hand, noting that she didn't pull away but didn't fully relax into the contact either. "Elena, I waited 22 years to find you. Again, I can wait however long it takes for you to feel safe enough to let me love you the way you deserve to be loved." As they sat together in the garden, surrounded by the scent of roses and the soft sounds of evening settling over Charleston, both Marcus and Elena understood that they were embarking on something far more complex than a simple reunion romance. They were two people who had been fundamentally changed by their individual journeys, attempting to build something new, while honoring both their shared past and their separate experiences of loss and growth. The road ahead would require patience, courage, and the kind of mature love that recognized healing as a prerequisite to happiness. But for the first time in decades, both of them felt hopeful about the possibility of a future that included not just professional success or personal security, but genuine human connection built on foundations strong enough to withstand whatever challenges might come. The crisis that would test everything they had built together came 6 months after Elena had settled into her new life. Arriving in the form of a sleek black sedan that pulled into Marcus's circular driveway on a Tuesday morning in April, Elena watched from her office window in the guest house as a tall, impeccably dressed woman emerged from the passenger seat, her movements carrying the kind of calculated grace that suggested she was accustomed to making entrances that commanded attention. Victoria Sterling was everything Elena was not, polished where Elena was genuine, commanding where Elena was collaborative, wealthy in her own right where Elena remained dependent on Marcus's generosity. At 42, Victoria had built an empire in commercial real estate development that rivaled Marcus's own holdings, and she moved through Charleston's business community with the confidence of someone who had never known vulnerability or defeat. Elena recognized her immediately from the society pages of the Charleston Post and Courier, where Victoria appeared regularly at charity galas and cultural events, always perfectly dressed and surrounded by the kind of people whose names appeared on hospital wings and university buildings. More troubling, Elena remembered reading speculation in the business section about a potential merger between Victoria's development firm and Marcus's commercial properties, a partnership that would create the most powerful real estate empire in South Carolina. The meeting, Elena learned later, had been scheduled for weeks. Victoria had requested a private breakfast to discuss what she termed mutually beneficial opportunities, and Marcus had agreed with the polite professionalism he showed to all potential business partners. But as Elena watched Victoria's confident stride toward the main house, she felt a familiar knot of anxiety form in her stomach. 3 hours passed before Victoria emerged from Marcus's house, and Elena tried to focus on her work while fighting the urge to analyze every detail of what she could observe from her window. Victoria's body language suggested the meeting had gone well. She moved with the satisfied air of someone who had accomplished her objectives. When Marcus walked her to her car, Elena noticed that Victoria placed her hand on his arm with casual familiarity, a gesture that implied greater intimacy than a simple business relationship would warrant. That evening, Marcus appeared at Elena's door with takeout containers from their favorite downtown restaurant and an expression that she had learned to associate with complicated news. They had developed a routine of sharing dinner several times a week, conversations that had gradually evolved from careful professional updates to genuine friendship. But tonight something felt different. "How was your meeting with Victoria Sterling?" Elena asked as they settled at her small dining table, trying to keep her tone neutral despite the curiosity that had been eating at her all day. Marcus seemed surprised that she knew about Victoria's visit, then remembered that Elena's office overlooked the main driveway. It was interesting. She has some ambitious ideas about expanding our respective businesses through strategic partnerships. Elena waited for him to elaborate, but Marcus seemed unusually reluctant to discuss the details. After 6 months of working together, she had learned to read his moods with increasing accuracy, and his current demeanor suggested internal conflict he wasn't ready to share. "Is that something you're interested in pursuing?" she prompted gently. Marcus sat down, his fork, and met her eyes with the kind of directness that had become characteristic of their most important conversations. "Elena, Victoria is proposing more than just a business partnership. She's suggesting a merger that would combine our companies into a single entity, with both of us as equal partners. It would create unprecedented opportunities for growth and Development throughout the Southeast. Elena felt her heart rate accelerate, though she wasn't entirely sure why. Marcus's business decisions were his own to make, and a successful merger would only increase the resources available for the community. Programs she had been developing. But something in his manner suggested that Victoria's proposal included elements he hadn't yet mentioned. "That sounds like an incredible opportunity," Elena said carefully. "What are your concerns?" Marcus was quiet for a long moment, and Elena could see him wrestling with how much to reveal. "Victoria made it clear that she sees our potential partnership extending beyond business. She believes that combining our companies would be more effective if it were supported by a personal relationship as well." The words hit Elena like a physical blow, though she tried to keep her reaction from showing on her face. Of course, Victoria. Sterling would be interested in Marcus romantically. He was successful, attractive, and represented exactly the kind of strategic alliance that would benefit someone in her position. More troubling was the possibility that Marcus might be considering her proposition seriously. "And how do you feel about that?" Elena asked, proud that her voice remained steady despite the turmoil she was experiencing internally. "I told her I wasn't available for that kind of relationship," Marcus replied. "But Elena, she made some points that I can't easily dismiss." Elena felt her stomach drop. "What kind of points?" Marcus pushed his food around his plate, clearly uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. "She pointed out that I'm 41 years old and that I've spent the last 22 years building a successful business, but failing to build a successful personal life. She suggested that I might be allowing nostalgia and guilt to prevent me from pursuing relationships that could actually work." The criticism stung because it contained elements of truth that Elena had been trying not to acknowledge. She was still healing from trauma, still struggling with trust issues, still unable to offer Marcus the kind of uncomplicated romantic partnership that someone like Victoria could provide. Was she being selfish by accepting his support while remaining emotionally unavailable? Was she preventing him from finding happiness with someone who could love him without reservation? "Maybe she's right," Elena said quietly, the words tasting bitter in her mouth. "Maybe you deserve someone who can give you what you're looking for without requiring so much patience and understanding." Marcus reached across the table and took her hand, his grip firm and reassuring. "Elena, don't you dare let Victoria Sterling's opinions make you question your worth or my commitment to what we're building together. Yes, she could offer me a business partnership that would make both of us extremely wealthy. Yes, she could probably provide the kind of conventional relationship that looks good in newspaper society pages. But I don't want conventional, and I don't need more wealth." He paused, his thumb tracing circles on the back of her hand. "What I want is the chance to build something real with someone who matters to me. What I want is to wake up every morning knowing that I'm supporting someone whose work makes the world better. What I want is to love someone who understands that true success isn't measured by profit margins, but by the positive impact you have on other people's lives." Elena felt tears threaten, moved by the sincerity in his voice, but also overwhelmed by the pressure of being someone's answer to decades of loneliness and searching. "Marcus, what if I can't be what you need? What if this trauma has changed me too fundamentally? What if I never feel safe enough to let you love me the way you want to?" "Then we'll figure it out together," Marcus replied without hesitation. "Elena, I'm not asking you to be someone you're not. I'm not pressuring you to heal faster than feels natural. I'm simply asking for the chance to be part of your life while you rediscover who you are when you feel secure and valued." The conversation was interrupted by Elena's phone ringing with a call from the Charleston Women's Shelter, where she had been volunteering on weekends. The caller was Sarah Martinez, the shelter's director, and her voice carried the kind of urgency that suggested a crisis requiring immediate attention. "Elena, I'm sorry to call so late, but we have a situation that requires someone with your background. We have a family here, mother and 2 children, who were just brought in by police after a domestic violence incident. The mother is highly educated, speaks several languages, and she's refusing to accept help because she's convinced that accepting assistance will somehow make her situation worse. Elena felt her chest tighten with recognition. She had encountered similar cases during her nonprofit work. Women whose professional backgrounds and middle-class identities made it difficult for them to accept that they needed the same services provided to people they had previously viewed as fundamentally different from themselves. "What do you need me to do?" Elena asked, already reaching for her jacket. "Could you come in and talk to her? I think she might respond better to someone who understands the complexity of maintaining dignity while accepting help. Someone who's been through their own version of losing everything and rebuilding." Elena looked at Marcus, who had already grabbed his car keys and was heading for the door. "We'll be there in 20 minutes, she said. The drive to the women's shelter passed in contemplative silence, both of them processing their earlier conversation while preparing for whatever crisis awaited them. Elena had been volunteering at the shelter for 3 months, finding that her recent experiences with homelessness and trauma gave her unique insight into helping other women navigate similar challenges. The shelter was located in a converted Victorian house in an older residential neighborhood, deliberately unassuming to protect the privacy and safety of its residents. Elena had grown to love the place not for its physical characteristics, which were modest at best, but for the atmosphere of hope and mutual support that pervaded every room. Sarah Martinez met them at the door, her expression carrying the kind of exhausted determination that Elena recognized in all effective nonprofit workers. Sarah was in her 50s, a former social worker who had founded the shelter after her own daughter had been killed by an abusive partner, and she possessed the rare combination of fierce advocacy and gentle compassion that made her extraordinarily effective at helping women in crisis. "Thank you for coming," Sarah said, leading them toward the shelter's common area. "Carmen Rodriguez, and yes, I know the name is familiar to you. Marcus is 34 years old, has a master's degree in education, speaks fluent English and Spanish, and until 3 days ago was a middle school principal. Her husband is a successful attorney who has been systematically isolating and abusing her for years, but he's careful enough that there's never been physical evidence that would hold up in court." Elena felt her heart break a little at the familiar pattern. Educated women, professional women, women with resources and social standing could still find themselves trapped in abusive relationships, often with fewer support systems than women who had never had the luxury of believing that bad things only happen to other people. "What finally made her leave?" Marcus asked. "He threatened the children," Sarah replied grimly. 8-year-old twin boys. Carmen came home from work to find bruises on their arms, and her husband explaining that the boys had been disrespectful and needed to learn proper behavior. That was apparently the line she couldn't let him cross. They found Carmen Rodriguez in the shelter's small library, a room that Elena had helped organize during her volunteer work. Carmen was exactly as Sarah had described, clearly intelligent, carefully dressed despite her circumstances, holding herself with the kind of rigid control that suggested she was barely keeping herself together through sheer force of will. Her twin sons sat on either side of her, reading picture books with the absorbed concentration of children trying to escape into stories that made more sense than their current reality. Both boys showed signs of the stress they had been under, shadows under their eyes that spoke to too many sleepless nights, a hypervigilance that made them look up nervously whenever anyone entered the room. "Carmen," Sarah said gently, "this is Elena Vasquez, the volunteer I mentioned. She's someone who understands what you're going through." Carmen looked up at Elena with eyes that held a mixture of desperation and skepticism. "Sarah says you can help me understand my options, but I have to tell you, I've already called 3 attorneys and 2 social service agencies. Everyone keeps telling me that leaving was the right thing to do, but no one can tell me how I'm supposed to rebuild my life from nothing. Elena settled into the chair across from Carmen, recognizing in the other woman's posture and expression the same fierce pride that had made accepting help so difficult for her own situation 6 months earlier. "Can you tell me what's worrying you most right now?" Carmen's laugh held no humor. "Where do I start? I have no money. Robert controlled all our finances, and I only found out this week that he's been emptying our joint accounts for months. I have no place to live. The house is in his name, and he's had the locks changed. I have no job. He convinced the school board that I was having emotional problems and needed to take a leave of absence." She gestured at her sons, who were pretending to read while obviously listening to every word. "These boys have been through enough trauma. They don't need to watch their mother become a charity case, dependent on handouts from strangers. They don't need to live in shelters and food banks and government housing while I try to figure out how to start over at 34 with nothing." Elena felt a wave of recognition so strong it was almost disorienting. Carmen's situation was different from her own, but the underlying fear was identical: the terror of losing not just financial security, but personal dignity, of being reduced from a competent professional to someone who needed rescuing. "Carmen," Elena said quietly, "what if I told you that accepting help doesn't make you a charity case? What if I told you that there's a difference between being dependent and being strategic about using available resources to rebuild your independence?" Over the next 2 hours, Elena shared her own story with Carmen, not the sanitized version she usually offered to casual acquainters, but the raw truth of her descent from nonprofit professional to homeless woman begging on street corners. She talked about the shame, the pride, the fear that accepting help would somehow diminish her fundamental worth as a human being. But she also talked about what she had learned, that dignity wasn't something that could be taken away by circumstances, that strength sometimes looked like accepting assistance, and that rebuilding a life required both courage and practical support from people who understood the journey. Marcus, meanwhile, played with Carmen's sons, engaging them in quiet conversations about books and drawing pictures that gradually helped them relax for the first time since their arrival at the shelter. Elena watched him interact with the boys and felt something shift in her understanding of who he had become over the past 6 months. This wasn't the isolated, emotionally distant businessman she had first encountered. This was someone who had learned to use his resources and influence to make a genuine difference in people's lives. Someone who understood that true success was measured by the positive impact you had on others rather than the wealth you accumulated for yourself. By the end of the evening, Carmen had agreed to accept temporary housing assistance while she consulted with an attorney about her legal options and began the process of rebuilding her professional life. More importantly, she had begun to understand that accepting help wasn't an admission of failure, but a practical step toward reclaiming her independence. As Marcus and Elena drove home through the quiet Charleston streets, they were both processing not just the evening's events, but the earlier conversation about Victoria Sterling's proposition. The crisis at the shelter had reminded them both of why their work together mattered, why the community programs Elena had developed were more than just business initiatives. They were lifelines for people facing circumstances that could overwhelm anyone. "Elena," Marcus said as they pulled into his driveway, "I want you to know that I've made my decision about Victoria's offer." Elena felt her heart rate accelerate, but she tried to keep her voice steady. "What have you decided?" Marcus turned off the engine and turned to face her, his expression serious but peaceful. "I'm going to decline the merger. Not because it wouldn't be profitable, but because success that requires me to compromise my values or abandon the people I care about isn't really success at all." Elena felt a rush of relief so intense it was almost overwhelming, but she forced herself to consider the implications of his decision. "Marcus, are you sure? This could be an incredible opportunity for growth, for expanding your influence and resources." My influence and resources are meaningless if I don't use them to support the people and causes that matter to me. Marcus replied, Elena, tonight reminded me of something I had forgotten during all those years of building my business empire. The purpose of success isn't just personal achievement, it's creating the capacity to make a positive difference in other people's lives. He reached across the car and took her hand, his grip warm and reassuring. I don't want to merge my life with someone who sees relationships as strategic opportunities. I want to build something real with someone who understands that love and friendship and community are more valuable than any business deal. Elena felt tears threaten, moved by his words but also aware of the enormous responsibility they represented. Marcus was choosing her over opportunities that could make him one of the most powerful men in the Southeast. He was betting his future on the possibility that what they were building together could become something extraordinary. What if I disappoint you? She asked quietly. What if this healing process takes longer than either of us expects? What if I never become the partner you're hoping for? Marcus smiled, and Elena saw in his expression something she had been afraid to hope for. Not just love, but patience, understanding, and genuine acceptance of who she was in this moment, rather than who she might become. Then we'll figure it out as we go, he said simply. Elena, I'm not investing in a guaranteed outcome. I'm investing in the possibility that two people who care about each other can build something meaningful together, whatever form that ends up taking. As they sat together in the quiet car, surrounded by the soft sounds of Charleston settling into evening, both Elena and Marcus understood that they had reached a turning point. Victoria Sterling's proposition had forced them to articulate what they were building together and why it mattered more than conventional measures of success or security. The future remained uncertain, filled with challenges neither could fully anticipate. But for the first time since their reunion, both of them felt ready to embrace that uncertainty together, confident that what they were creating was worth whatever risks it might require. The newspaper article appeared on a Sunday morning in late September, buried on page 3 of the Charleston Post and Courier's business section, beneath a photograph that made Elena's blood run cold. The headline read, Sterling Development Challenges Rothwell Holdings in Eastside Redevelopment Bid. But it was the accompanying image that told the real story. Victoria Sterling shaking hands with Mayor Patricia Williams while holding a thick folder of documents, her smile radiating the confidence of someone who held all the winning cards. Elena read the article twice over her morning coffee, her anxiety mounting with each paragraph. Victoria hadn't simply accepted Marcus's rejection of her merger proposal. She had declared war. Using her political connections and financial resources, Victoria had convinced the city council to reconsider the Eastside Redevelopment Project, a massive urban renewal initiative that Marcus had been developing for 3 years and which represented the cornerstone of his community-focused business philosophy. The Eastside Project was everything Elena had helped Marcus envision during their months of working together. Instead of the typical gentrification model that displaced existing residents in favor of upscale retail and luxury housing, Marcus's plan included affordable housing units, community health centers, job training programs, and spaces for local businesses to thrive. It was ambitious, expensive, and designed to lift up the neighborhood's current residents rather than replace them with wealthier newcomers. Victoria's competing proposal, according to the article, promised faster development, higher tax revenues, and what she termed a more realistic approach to urban renewal. The language was diplomatic, but Elena understood the subtext. Victoria was offering the city a traditional development model that would generate immediate profits while Marcus was pursuing a vision that prioritized long-term community benefit over short-term financial gains. Marcus found Elena in the guesthouse garden an hour later, still holding the newspaper and staring at the photograph with the intensity of someone trying to decode a complex puzzle. He looked exhausted, and Elena realized he had probably been fielding phone calls from city council members, business partners, and reporters since dawn. How bad is it? Elena asked without preamble. Marcus settled onto the garden bench beside her, his usual composure cracked by the stress of the morning's revelations. Worse than I initially thought. Victoria didn't just submit a competing proposal, she spent the past 4 months systematically undermining the political support I thought I had secured. She's convinced 3 council members that my approach is too idealistic and financially risky for the city to support. Elena felt anger rising in her chest, not just at Victoria's tactics, but at the broader injustice of a system that rewarded cynicism over compassion, profit over community welfare. What are your options? I could fight it, Marcus replied, his voice carrying the weariness of someone who had been considering unpalatable alternatives all morning. I could match Victoria's political maneuvering, make promises I'm not sure I can keep, compromise the community aspects of the project to make it more financially attractive to nervous city officials. He paused, staring at the roses Elena had been tending with increasing skill over the past months. Or I could walk away. Let Victoria have the project and find other ways to make a positive impact that don't require navigating Charleston's political machinery. Elena studied his profile, noting the tension in his jaw and the way his hands gripped the newspaper with barely controlled frustration. This project had become more than just a business venture for Marcus. It represented his transformation. From the isolated silent baron into someone who used his resources to lift up others, rather than simply accumulating wealth for its own sake. There's a third option, Elena said quietly. Marcus turned to look at her, his expression hopeful but cautious. What do you have in mind? We fight, but we fight differently. Victoria is using traditional political and financial pressure because that's the language she speaks fluently. But you have something she doesn't have: genuine community support from the people who would actually be affected by this development. Elena's mind was already working through the possibilities, drawing on her nonprofit experience to envision a grassroots campaign that could counter Victoria's top-down political strategy. What if we organized the East Side residents themselves? What if we helped them tell their own stories about what kind of development they want for their neighborhood? Marcus's eyes brightened with the first real hope she had seen from him all morning. A community organizing campaign. Public meetings, resident testimonials, media outreach that highlights the human impact of different development approaches. Exactly. Victoria can buy political influence, but she can't manufacture authentic community support. If we can demonstrate that your project has genuine grassroots backing from the people who live in the East Side, it becomes much harder for city council members to ignore their constituents in favor of campaign contributors. The strategy Elena outlined was ambitious and time-consuming, requiring them to build coalitions among residents who had little reason to trust developers of any kind. It would mean countless evening meetings in community centers and church basements, door-to-door conversations with families who had seen previous promises of neighborhood improvement turn into displacement and gentrification. But it was also the kind of work that played to both their strengths. Marcus's business acumen and financial resources combined with Elena's experience in community organizing and her ability to communicate with people who felt overlooked by traditional power structures. Over the following weeks, Elena threw herself into the campaign with an energy and passion that surprised even her. She spent her days conducting research and developing messaging strategies, but her evenings and weekends were devoted to the kind of grassroots organizing she had learned during her nonprofit years. The first community meeting, held in the basement of Mount Olive Baptist Church on a Tuesday evening in October, drew only 12 residents despite Elena's extensive outreach efforts. The attendees were skeptical, having heard too many promises from developers and politicians who disappeared once their projects were approved or their elections were won. Mrs. Dorothy Washington, a retired teacher who had lived in the East Side for 47 years, voiced the concerns that Elena could see reflected in every face around the folding table. "Miss Vasquez, you talk a good game about affordable housing and job training programs. But how do we know this isn't just another way to push us out so rich folks can move in?" Elena had anticipated this question, but she also knew that her answer needed to be more than just reassuring words. "Mrs. Washington, you're absolutely right to be suspicious. I've seen too many communities promise development that would benefit them, only to watch those promises disappear once the construction began." She opened her laptop and projected a detailed financial breakdown of Marcus's proposal onto the church's portable screen. "But here's what's different about Mr. Rothwell's plan. First, 40% of the new housing units are legally required to remain affordable in perpetuity, not just for the first few years. Second, the job training programs are funded through a community trust that gives neighborhood residents control over how the money is spent." Elena clicked to the next slide, showing architectural renderings that featured community gardens, a health clinic, and spaces specifically designed for local businesses. Most importantly, the project includes binding commitments that current residents can't be displaced without their consent, and that any new businesses must hire a certain percentage of their workforce from the neighborhood. The presentation continued for an hour, with Elena answering questions that ranged from technical details about construction timelines to philosophical concerns about whether any development could truly benefit existing residents without changing the character of their community. Gradually, she could see the skepticism in the room shifting toward cautious interest. Marcus had deliberately stayed away from this first meeting, recognizing that his presence might make residents less willing to voice their honest concerns. But Elena could feel his influence in the thoroughness of the planning documents he was able to share, the legal commitments he was willing to make, the financial transparency he had insisted on despite the competitive disadvantage it might create. By the meeting's end, Mrs. Washington had agreed to help Elena organize additional community gatherings, and 3 other residents had volunteered to serve on a neighborhood oversight committee that would monitor the project's implementation if it was approved. "You know," Mrs. Washington said as Elena packed up her materials, "I've lived through 4 different developers promising to improve this neighborhood. You're the first one who's ever asked us what improvement would look like from our perspective." The grassroots campaign that Elena organized over the following month was unlike anything Charleston had seen in recent memory. Instead of the typical public hearings where residents had 3 minutes to voice concerns that officials might or might not consider, Elena created multiple forums for genuine community input. She organized small group discussions in residents' homes, where people could speak honestly about their hopes and fears without feeling intimidated by formal government settings. She arranged for community members to visit similar development projects in other cities, giving them first-hand experience of what successful community-centered development looked like. Most importantly, she helped residents develop their own presentation for the city council, not a petition or form letter, but a comprehensive community vision that demonstrated the depth of thought and planning that had gone into their support for Marcus's proposal. The contrast with Victoria Sterling's approach became increasingly stark as the campaign progressed. While Victoria held private meetings with city officials and relied on professional lobbyists to make her case, Elena's efforts generated genuine community engagement that was impossible to ignore or dismiss. Local media began covering the story, not just as a business dispute between 2 developers, but as a broader question about what kind of development Charleston wanted to support. The community meetings Elena organized drew increasingly large crowds, with residents who had never been politically active before joining the effort to advocate for Marcus's vision. Victoria's response was swift and predictable. She increased her campaign contributions to city council members, hired additional lobbyists, and began spreading rumors about Marcus's financial stability and Elena's qualifications to represent community interests. The personal attacks on Elena were particularly vicious, with anonymous sources suggesting to reporters that her recent history of homelessness made her an unreliable advocate for community development. The implication was clear. How could someone who had failed so spectacularly in her own life be trusted to guide neighborhood planning decisions? Elena felt each attack like a physical blow, but she was surprised to discover that the criticism also strengthened her resolve. The same experiences that Victoria's allies were using to discredit her poverty, trauma, dependence on others' generosity had given her insights into community needs that no amount of professional training could provide. "They're trying to shame me for having been homeless," Elena told Marcus after a particularly difficult day of responding to media inquiries about her background. "They want people to think that my experience with poverty makes me less qualified to advocate for community development, not more." Marcus felt his own anger building as he watched Elena process the personal attacks she was enduring on his behalf. "Elena, you don't have to continue with this campaign if it's becoming too personally costly. We can find other ways to fight for the project." But Elena shook her head with the determination Marcus remembered from their teenage years. "Marcus, this is exactly why this work matters." Victoria Sterling looks at the east side and sees property values and profit margins. "I look at the same neighborhood and see Mrs. Washington, who's afraid she won't be able to afford her property taxes if gentrification drives them up. I see Carmen Rodriguez, who needs job training programs so she can rebuild her career after escaping an abusive marriage." She paused, her eyes bright with conviction. "My experience with homelessness doesn't disqualify me from advocating for community development. It gives me perspective that developers like Victoria will never have. I understand what it feels like to be powerless, to have decisions made about your life by people who've never faced the consequences of those decisions." The turning point came during the final city council meeting before the development decision would be made. Victoria had arranged for a presentation that emphasized the financial benefits of her proposal, complete with charts showing projected tax revenues and job creation numbers that looked impressive on paper. But when Elena's community coalition took the floor, they offered something Victoria couldn't match: authentic testimony from people whose lives would be directly affected by the development choice. Mrs. Washington spoke about her grandchildren and her hope that they could afford to remain in the neighborhood where 3 generations of her family had built their lives. Carmen Rodriguez, who had successfully rebuilt her career with support from Marcus's job training initiatives, testified about the importance of development that prioritized community stability over maximum profit. A dozen other residents shared similar stories, creating a powerful narrative about what community-centered development could accomplish. The council's vote was closer than Elena had hoped, but decisive enough to feel like vindication. By a margin of 4-3, they approved Marcus's proposal, citing the unprecedented level of community support and the project's innovative approach to neighborhood development. Victoria's response to the defeat was gracious in public, but privately devastating. Within a week, she had used her media connections to plant stories questioning the long-term financial viability of Marcus's approach, predicting that his idealistic development model would collapse within 2 years, leaving the city responsible for cleanup and debt. But Elena felt something she hadn't experienced since before: David's death, the deep satisfaction that comes from using your skills and energy to achieve something meaningful that helps other people. The grassroots campaign had reminded her that her nonprofit background and recent experiences with trauma gave her unique qualifications for advocacy work, not disqualifications. More importantly, the campaign had shown both her and Marcus that their partnership could accomplish things neither could achieve alone. His resources and business expertise combined with her community organizing skills and authentic understanding of residents' concerns had created a powerful force for positive change. As they sat in the garden that evening, reviewing newspaper coverage of the council vote and planning next steps for project implementation, Elena realized that something fundamental had shifted in their relationship. The trauma and insecurity that had made her cautious about emotional intimacy were still present, but they no longer felt like insurmountable obstacles. "Marcus," she said, setting down the newspaper and turning to face him fully, "I think I'm ready." He looked at her with the careful attention she had come to associate with their most important conversations. "Ready for what?" Elena took his hand, noting that her fingers no longer trembled when she initiated physical contact. "Ready to stop being afraid that happiness will disappear if I let myself feel it completely. Ready to trust that what we're building together is strong enough to weather whatever challenges come next." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "Ready to love you not just as the boy I remembered, but as the man you've become. Ready to let you love me as the woman I am now, scars and strength and all." Marcus's smile was radiant, transforming his face with joy that had been building for months, but held in careful check. "Elena, are you sure? I don't want you to feel pressured by tonight's success or gratitude for my support during the campaign." Elena laughed, the sound carrying more genuine happiness than Marcus had heard from her since their reunion. "Marcus Rothwell, I've spent 10 months learning that love isn't something that happens to you, it's something you choose. Every day, with full knowledge of the risks and rewards involved." As they kissed in the garden where Elena had been learning to trust her own strength, both understood that they were finally ready to build not just professional partnerships or careful friendships, but the kind of deep, committed love that could serve as foundation for whatever future they chose to create together. 2 years after the East Side development project broke ground, Charleston awoke to a different kind of newspaper headline. This time, Elena's photograph appeared above the fold on the front page of the Sunday edition, not as a victim or charity case, but as the recipient of the state's Community Leadership Award for her innovative approach to neighborhood development advocacy. The article described Elena's transformation into one of South Carolina's most effective community organizers, detailing how her work had influenced development projects across 3 counties and inspired a new model for resident-centered urban planning. But what the newspaper couldn't capture was the quieter transformation that had taken place in her personal life, the gradual healing that had allowed her to rebuild not just her career, but her capacity for joy, trust, and love. Marcus read the article over breakfast in the main house kitchen, a space that had been transformed from a sterile showpiece into the warm heart of a home, where friends gathered regularly and laughter was a common sound. Elena had moved from the guest house into the main house 18 months earlier, and her presence had brought life to rooms that had stood empty for decades. The kitchen walls now displayed children's artwork from the after-school program Elena had started for East Side families, alongside photographs of community celebrations and groundbreaking ceremonies. The formal dining room had been converted into a meeting space where neighborhood leaders gathered monthly to discuss ongoing development initiatives and plan new projects. Elena found Marcus at the kitchen table, still in his pajamas despite the late morning hour, a level of casual comfort that would have been unimaginable during his years as the Silent Baron. She was dressed for their planned visit to the East Side construction site, where the first phase of housing units was nearing completion and families were preparing to move into homes they had helped design through Elena's community input process. "Still reading about your famous girlfriend?" Elena teased, settling into the chair beside him and stealing a piece of his toast. Marcus smiled, noting how naturally Elena used the word girlfriend, despite their relationship having evolved far beyond such simple labels. They had been talking about marriage for months, but both were committed to ensuring that their decision grew from mutual desire rather than social expectations or practical convenience. "I'm reading about a remarkable woman who's managed to change an entire city's approach to community development," Marcus replied, pulling Elena close enough to kiss her temple. "I'm just lucky enough that she tolerates my presence in her busy schedule." Elena laughed, the sound carrying none of the careful guardedness that had characterized her emotions during the early months of their reunion. "Your presence is more than tolerated, Mr. Rothwell. In fact, I have a proposal for you." Marcus felt his heart rate accelerate, wondering if Elena was about to initiate the conversation about marriage that they had been approaching cautiously for weeks. But her next words took him in an entirely different direction. "I want us to expand the community development model we've created here. There are neighborhoods in Columbia, Greenville, and Savannah that could benefit from similar approaches to resident-centered planning. I want to create a nonprofit organization that can take this work statewide, maybe even regional." Marcus studied her face, noting the excitement and determination that animated her features when she discussed work that mattered to her. "That's an incredible vision, Elena. What would you need to make it happen?" "A significant financial investment. For startup costs, office space, staff salaries for at least the first 3 years while we build sustainable funding sources," Elena replied, her voice carrying the practical tone of someone who had learned to balance idealism with realistic planning. "Probably around $2 million to do it properly." Marcus nodded, his mind already working through the logistics of funding such an ambitious expansion. "Consider it done. When do you want to start?" Elena's reaction was not the gratitude or excitement Marcus had expected. Instead, she grew quiet, her expression shifting to something that looked almost like disappointment. "Marcus, that's not how I want this to work between us. What do you mean?" Elena stood and moved to the kitchen window, looking out at the garden, where they had shared so many important conversations over the past 2 years. "I don't want to be your charitable project forever. I don't want every idea I have to be funded by your generosity. I want us to be partners, not benefactor and recipient." Marcus felt a stab of hurt at her words, followed quickly by understanding. Despite all the progress Elena had made in healing from her trauma, despite their successful collaboration on the East Side project, she was still struggling with the fundamental imbalance of resources between them. "Elena, what would partnership look like to you?" She turned back to face him, her expression serious but not withdrawn. "I want us to apply for grants together. I want to present our ideas to foundations and government agencies as co-founders, not as a wealthy man and the woman he sponsors. I want to succeed or fail based on the strength of our work, not the size of your bank account." It was perhaps the most direct challenge Elena had ever made to the dynamic of their relationship, and Marcus recognized that his response would determine whether they could truly move forward as equals or would remain trapped in patterns of dependence that diminished them both. "You're absolutely right," he said after a moment of consideration. "I've been solving problems with money for so long that I forgot there are other ways to build something meaningful. What do you need from me as your partner rather than your benefactor?" Elena's smile was radiant, transforming her face with the kind of joy that Marcus had learned to treasure above any business success. "I need your business expertise, your connections in the nonprofit world, your ability to navigate complex financial structures. I need your brain and your network and your commitment to the work, not just your checkbook." Over the following hour, they outlined a partnership structure that would pool their different strengths while maintaining Elena's autonomy and dignity. Marcus would provide initial funding as a loan to be repaid from future grant awards, while Elena would lead the programmatic work and community organizing that formed the heart of their mission. The conversation was interrupted by a knock at the kitchen door, an informal entrance that friends and neighbors had learned to use rather than the intimidating formal front entrance. Carmen Rodriguez appeared in the doorway, now dressed in professional attire, but carrying the relaxed confidence of someone who belonged in this space. Carmen had become one of Elena's closest friends and most trusted collaborators over the past year, having completed a master's degree in urban planning while working part-time for Marcus's development company. Her twin sons, now 10 years old, treated Marcus and Elena's house as a second home, and their laughter often filled the rooms that had once echoed with nothing but Marcus's solitary footsteps. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything important," Carmen said, noting the serious expressions on their faces, "but I have news that couldn't wait." Elena gestured for Carmen to join them at the kitchen table. "What's going on?" Carmen's smile was mysterious, suggesting she was enjoying having information that would surprise them. "I just got off the phone with Mayor Williams. The city has received a federal grant application from Victoria Sterling's development company requesting funding to replicate the Charleston model of community-centered development in 3 other South Carolina cities." Marcus felt his jaw tighten with anger at Victoria's audacity. "She's trying to steal credit for our work and profit from the model we developed." "Actually," Carmen continued, her smile growing wider, "the grant application specifically credits Elena's community organizing methods and requests that Elena serve as a consultant on all 3 projects." Victoria apparently told the federal reviewers that the Charleston project's success was entirely dependent on Elena's innovative approach to resident engagement. Elena stared at Carmen in amazement. "Victoria Sterling wants to hire me." "More than that," Carmen replied. "She wants to partner with you. The grant application proposes a joint venture between Sterling Development and whatever organization you create, with profit sharing based on successful project completion and community satisfaction metrics." The irony was not lost on any of them. Victoria, who had tried to destroy Marcus's project and discredit Elena's qualifications, was now seeking to profit from the very model she had opposed. But more significantly, she was offering Elena something that Marcus never could: professional recognition from the business community that didn't depend on their personal relationship. "What do you think?" Marcus asked Elena, noting the complex emotions playing across her face. Elena was quiet for several minutes, clearly working through the implications of Victoria's offer. "I think it's an opportunity to prove that our approach can work beyond Charleston, even when it's not supported by someone who loves me personally. I think it's a chance to demonstrate that community-centered development is financially viable, not just socially responsible." She paused, meeting Marcus's eyes with the direct honesty that had become characteristic of their most important conversations. "And I think it's a way for me to establish professional credibility that exists independently of our relationship, which might be healthy for both of us." Marcus felt a complex mixture of pride and loss at Elena's words. He was proud of her growth into someone who could consider major career decisions based on professional merit rather than emotional security. But he also felt the selfish desire to keep her close, to remain her primary source of support and collaboration. "Would you consider Victoria's offers seriously?" he asked. "I'd want to negotiate the terms carefully, and I'd want you involved as a consultant rather than just an observer," Elena replied. "But yes, I think this could be exactly the opportunity we've been looking for to expand our impact beyond Charleston." The conversation continued for another hour, with Carmen contributing insights from her urban planning background and Marcus providing perspective on the financial and logistical challenges of multi-city development projects. By its end, they had outlined a counter-proposal that would give Elena significant autonomy while ensuring that the community-centered model remained authentic to its original principles. 6 months later, Elena stood before a packed auditorium at the University of South Carolina, delivering the keynote address at the annual Conference on Sustainable Community Development. Her topic was From Homelessness to Hope: How Personal Experience Informs Professional Practice, and her audience included urban planners, social workers, nonprofit leaders, and government officials from across the Southeast. Marcus sat in the government officials from across the Southeast. Marcus sat in the faience third row, watching Elena command the stage with confidence that would have been unimaginable 3 years earlier. She spoke about her journey from executive director of a small nonprofit to homeless woman begging on street corners, then to nationally recognized expert in community-centered development, without once presenting herself as either victim or hero. Instead, she discussed the insights that trauma and recovery had given her into the real needs of communities facing displacement and economic insecurity. She shared specific examples of how her personal experience with powerlessness had informed her professional approach to ensuring that residents maintained control over development decisions affecting their neighborhoods. Expertise doesn't only come from graduate degrees and professional credentials, Elena told the audience. Sometimes the most valuable insights come from lived experience, from having faced the same challenges you're trying to solve for other people. She described the partnership model she and Marcus had developed, emphasizing how combining traditional business resources with grassroots organizing had created development projects that served community needs rather than just developer profits. She spoke about the importance of genuine partnership rather than charity, of building systems that empowered people rather than creating dependence. The standing ovation that followed Elena's presentation lasted nearly 5 minutes, but Marcus was more interested in the conversations that happened afterward. Urban planners from Atlanta wanted to adapt Elena's methods for public housing redevelopment. Social workers from Charlotte sought advice on organizing residents around gentrification concerns. Government officials from Raleigh inquired about funding models that could support community-controlled development. Elena handled each conversation with the poise of someone who had learned to value her own expertise while remaining approachable to people seeking guidance. Marcus felt enormous pride watching her, but it was the pride of an equal celebrating another's success rather than a benefactor taking credit for someone else's achievements. That evening, they drove back to Charleston through countryside that had become familiar over 3 years of traveling together to various development sites and community meetings. The comfortable silence between them was filled with the satisfaction of shared accomplishment and the anticipation of challenges still ahead. "Elena," Marcus said as they approached the city limits, "I have something I need to ask you." Elena looked at him with the slight smile of someone who had been expecting this conversation. "Go ahead." Marcus pulled into the parking lot of Hampton Park, the same location where they had shared their first kiss as teenagers, and where they had argued about their future the night before graduation. The symbolism was deliberate, and Elena recognized it immediately. "I know we've talked about marriage in general terms," Marcus began, his voice carrying the nervousness of someone whose entire future depended on the next few minutes. "But I want to be specific about what I'm asking and why." He turned in his seat to face her fully. "Elena, I'm not asking you to marry me because I rescued you from homelessness or because I can provide you with financial security. I'm not asking because we have a successful working relationship or because we're comfortable together." Marcus paused, choosing his words with the care of someone who understood that this moment would define the rest of their lives. "I'm asking you to marry me because you've taught me what it means to love someone as they actually are, rather than as I wish they were. Because you've shown me that real partnership requires vulnerability, not just compatibility. Because when I imagine growing old, I can't picture it happening with anyone but you." Elena's eyes filled with tears, but her smile was radiant. "Marcus Rodriguez Rothwell," she said, using the full name that honored both his original identity and his chosen one. "Are you asking me to marry you as equals?" "I'm asking you to marry me as the person I want to spend the rest of my life becoming," Marcus replied. "Someone worthy of loving you and being loved by you in return." Elena's kiss was her answer, but she followed it with words that made their commitment explicit. "Yes, I'll marry you. Not because you saved me, but because we saved each other. Not because you can provide for me, but because we can build something together that neither of us could create alone." As they sat together in the parking lot where their story had begun so many years earlier, both Marcus and Elena understood that they had achieved something rare and precious. They had found their way back to each other, not as the idealistic teenagers they had once been, but as adults who had learned from loss, grown through adversity, and chosen love with full understanding of its costs and rewards. The silent Baron had discovered that true wealth wasn't measured in properties owned or deals completed, but in the depth of connection possible between two people who chose to be vulnerable with each other. And Elena had learned that accepting love wasn't the same as accepting charity. That partnership could exist between people of different resources if it was built on mutual respect and shared values. Their wedding 6 months later was held not in one of Charleston's grand venues, but in the community center that had been built as part of the East Side Development Project. The ceremony was officiated by Carmen Rodriguez, who had been ordained online specifically for the occasion, and the reception featured food from local restaurants that had been supported by Marcus's small business initiatives. Mrs. Dorothy Washington, now 81 and serving as the neighborhood's unofficial grandmother, offered the toast that best captured what their relationship had come to mean to the wider community. Marcus and Elena didn't just find love again, they showed all of us what it looks like when people use their blessings to lift each other up instead of just themselves. The nonprofit organization they founded together, Community Partners Development, went on to influence housing policy across the Southeast and train a new generation of community organizers who understood that sustainable development required genuine partnership with the people it claimed to serve. But their greatest achievement wasn't professional. It was the proof they offered that second chances could lead to better endings than anyone dared dream. That love deferred could become love renewed. And that sometimes the most extraordinary transformations began with the simple act of seeing someone who had become invisible and choosing to help rather than look away. 5 years after Marcus had found Elena begging on a Charleston street corner, they stood together on the porch of their home, watching neighborhood children play in the community garden Elena had designed and Marcus had funded. Their own children, twin daughters adopted from the foster care system, ran among the flowers with the joyful abandon of kids who had never known anything but security and love. "Any regrets?" Elena asked, echoing the question Marcus had posed on their wedding day. Marcus pulled her closer, breathing in the scent of jasmine from the garden and the more complex fragrance of a life built on mutual respect, shared purpose, and love that had survived every test that circumstances could devise. "Only one," he replied, smiling at her look of surprise. "I regret that it took us so long to understand that the best love stories aren't about perfect people finding each other, but about imperfect people choosing to build something beautiful together despite their scars." Elena laughed, the sound carrying across the garden and mixing with their daughter's giggles to create the symphony of a family that had been assembled through intention rather than accident, through choice rather than chance. The silent Baron had found his voice at last, and it was saying exactly what Elena had always needed to hear, that she was seen, valued, and loved not despite her struggles, but because of the strength and wisdom those struggles had given her. And Elena had discovered that accepting love wasn't a surrender of independence, but an expansion of possibility. That partnership could multiply, rather than diminish her capacity to make a difference in the world. Their story would be told and retold in Charleston for decades to come, inspiring other acts of generosity and courage, proving that sometimes the most ordinary Tuesday afternoon could become the beginning of something extraordinary. If two people were brave enough to choose love over fear, partnership over isolation, and hope over the cynical assumption that nothing good could last. The cowboy story had ended with a wedding and community celebration. But the silent Baron's story ended with something rarer and more precious, a love that had transformed not just two individuals, but an entire community, proving that the greatest miracles often begin with the simple decision to see someone else's humanity and respond with kindness rather than indifference. 10 years had passed since that scorching October morning when Marcus Rothwell first saw Elena Vasquez holding a cardboard sign beneath the weathered awning of an abandoned storefront. Charleston had changed in the decades since, but perhaps nowhere more dramatically than in the neighborhoods where community partners development had taken root and flourished. The annual Community Impact Awards ceremony was held at the newly constructed Charleston Convention Center, a building that itself represented the kind of development Elena and Marcus had pioneered, designed with input from surrounding neighborhoods, built with local labor, and programmed to serve community needs rather than just generate revenue. Elena stood at the podium, her silver hair catching the stage lights as she prepared to present the evening's final award. At 52, she had grown into the kind of leader people followed not because they had to, but because they wanted to see where her vision would take them. The years had etched laugh lines around her eyes and given her the comfortable confidence of someone who had learned to trust her own judgment. Tonight's Lifetime Achievement Award, Elena announced to the packed auditorium, recognizes someone who understood before most of us that true wealth isn't measured in properties owned or profits accumulated, but in lives transformed and communities strengthened. Marcus sat in the front row, trying not to fidget with his tie as he realized what was happening. They had told him he was attending as a guest of honor, not as the evening's final recipient. Beside him, their teenage daughters, Sophia and Isabella, now 16 and as different as night and day, despite being twins, grinned with the satisfaction of co-conspirators who had helped plan this surprise. Marcus Rothwell began his career as what Charleston's newspapers called the Silent Baron. Elena continued, her voice carrying across the auditorium to the hundreds of community leaders, city officials, and neighborhood residents who had gathered for the ceremony. He was a man who had achieved everything our society tells us to want: wealth, power, influence, and discovered that none of it could fill the empty spaces where human connection should have been. Elena's eyes found Marcus in the audience, and her smile carried 20 years of shared memories, challenges overcome, and love that had deepened rather than faded with time. But Marcus's real story began the day he chose to see someone the rest of the world had learned to ignore. It began when he decided that his success was meaningless unless it served something larger than his own security. The presentation that followed chronicled not just Marcus's transformation from isolated businessman to community advocate, but the ripple effects of that change throughout Charleston and beyond. Community Partners Development had influenced housing policy in 12 states, trained over 300 community organizers, and helped establish resident-controlled development in 47 neighborhoods. But the statistics, impressive as they were, couldn't capture the individual stories that had defined their work. Mrs. Dorothy Washington, now 88 and still living in the East Side home, where she had raised 3 generations of her family, served on the organization's board of directors and remained its most passionate advocate for keeping community control at the center of all development decisions. Carmen Rodriguez had completed her doctorate in urban planning and now directed Community Partners training programs, teaching other survivors of domestic violence how to channel their experiences into advocacy for systemic change. Her twin sons, now 20 and attending college on scholarships funded by Marcus's educational initiatives, spent their summers working with neighborhood organizing projects. Victoria Sterling, in a twist that no one could have predicted, had become one of Community Partners' most effective corporate partners. Her development company had adopted Elena's community engagement model for all its projects, and Victoria herself served on the organization's advisory board, bringing her business expertise to bear on ensuring long-term financial sustainability. "Man I'm honoring tonight," Elena concluded, "learned something that our culture rarely teaches, that the purpose of individual success is to create the capacity for collective flourishing. That true leadership means using your advantages to lift others up, not just to lift yourself higher." Marcus felt his throat tighten with emotion as he rose to accept the award, a handcrafted sculpture created by teenagers from the East Side After School program. The weight of it in his hands represented far more than individual recognition. It symbolized everything he and Elena had built together, all the lives they had touched, all the communities they had helped transform. His acceptance speech was brief, characteristic of someone who had learned that the most important words were often the simplest ones. This award belongs to everyone who believed that Charleston could be a city where success was measured not by how much you accumulated, but by how much you shared. It belongs to Elena, who taught me that love is not something that happens to you, but something you choose every day. And it belongs to every community member who proved that ordinary people, working together, can create extraordinary change. After the ceremony, the celebration moved to the rooftop garden of the convention center, where the lights of Charleston sparkled below like earthbound stars. Elena found Marcus standing at the railing, looking out over the city that had become their life's work and their greatest collaboration. Having second thoughts about all the attention? She asked, settling beside him with the easy companionship of two people who had learned to share both victories and challenges. Marcus smiled, pulling her close in a gesture that had become as natural as breathing over their 20 years together. Just thinking about how different everything looks from up here. 10 years ago, I thought success meant owning as much of that skyline as possible. Now I look at it and see communities, see people whose lives are better because we learned to work together. Elena followed his gaze across the city, noting how the development patterns had changed over the decade. Where once there had been sharp divides between wealthy and poor neighborhoods, now there were transition areas where affordable housing mixed with market-rate homes, where community centers anchored commercial districts designed to serve residents, rather than just extract profit from them. Do you think we've done enough? Elena asked, voicing a question that had been recurring more frequently as they both approached their 60th birthdays. Marcus considered the question seriously, as he did all of Elena's inquiries about their work and their future. I think we've done what we could with the time and resources we were given. But more importantly, I think we've trained a generation of leaders who will continue this work long after we're ready to step back. They stood together in comfortable silence, surrounded by the sounds of the celebration continuing behind them, laughter from their daughters, who were showing off the evening's award to their friends. Conversations between community leaders planning next year's initiatives. The soft jazz quartet that Elena had insisted on hiring because she remembered how much Marcus had loved music before success had crowded out room for simple pleasures. Elena, Marcus said eventually, his voice carrying the weight of a decision he had been considering for months, I want to talk to you about something. Elena turned to face him, noting the serious expression that usually preceded their most important conversations. What's on your mind? I've been thinking about what comes next for us. Community Partners is stable, well-funded, and led by people who understand its mission better than we do now. Our daughters will be starting college in 2 years. For the first time since we found each other again, we have the luxury of choosing our next chapter based on what we want rather than what others need from us. Elena felt her pulse quicken, recognizing that Marcus was approaching the conversation they had been dancing around for months. What do you want our next chapter to look like? Marcus smiled, reaching into his jacket pocket to withdraw a thick envelope that Elena recognized as travel brochures. I want to see the places we dreamed about visiting when we were 17. I want to take you to Spain and show you the architecture that inspired my early real estate investments. I want us to visit the communities in Costa Rica, where your nonprofit development model is being adapted for rural areas. He paused, his eyes bright with the kind of enthusiasm Elena remembered from their teenage years. But mostly, I want to travel with you not as business partners or community advocates, but simply as two people who love each other and want to explore the world together. Elena felt tears threaten, moved by the image Marcus was painting, but also aware of the deeper implications of what he was suggesting. Are you talking about retirement? I'm talking about evolution, Marcus replied. We've spent 20 years proving that individual success can serve collective good. Now I want us to model something equally important, that love can deepen and grow and remain adventurous even when the urgent crises have been resolved and the major battles have been won. Elena considered his words, imagining the freedom of travel without committee meetings to return to, the luxury of discovering new places without immediately analyzing their development patterns or organizing strategies. For 2 decades, their relationship had been defined by shared work and mutual support through professional challenges. The prospect of discovering who they were together when their time was entirely their own was both thrilling and slightly terrifying. What about community partners? What about the neighborhoods that depend on our advocacy? Marcus gestured toward the celebration continuing behind them, where Carmen Rodriguez was deep in conversation with 3 city council members about upcoming zoning decisions, where their daughters were explaining community organizing principles to college friends who had never considered that business could serve social purposes. Look around, Elena. We've built something that doesn't depend on us anymore. We've trained leaders who will carry this work forward, created systems that will outlast our personal involvement. The best gift we can give to the movement we've built is to demonstrate that sustainable change doesn't require its founders to sacrifice their personal happiness indefinitely. As if summoned by their conversation, Sophia and Isabella appeared at their parents' sides, both young women radiant with the confidence of teenagers who had grown up, believing they could change the world because they had watched their parents do exactly that. Mom, Dad, Sophia announced with the dramatic flair that had characterized her personality since childhood, we have something to tell you. Isabella, more reserved but equally determined, continued their prepared statement. We've been talking about college plans, and we've decided we want to study international development and community organizing. We want to take the work you've done here and adapt it for other countries, other communities that need similar approaches. Elena felt her heart swell with pride and something that might have been relief. Their daughters had grown up surrounded by examples of people using their privileges to serve others, and they had internalized those values so completely that continuing the family's commitment to social justice felt natural rather than obligatory. That's wonderful, Elena said, pulling both girls into a hug. But you know you don't have to follow in our footsteps just because it's what we chose. We're not following in your footsteps, Sophia replied with the certainty of youth combined with genuine wisdom. We're creating our own path, using the tools you taught us, but applying them to challenges you haven't tackled yet. Isabella nodded agreement. Besides, someone needs to carry on community partners' work while you two go off on your second honeymoon that's apparently going to last several years. Marcus laughed, realizing that their daughters had been eavesdropping on conversations about travel and retirement that he and Elena thought they had been having privately. Is our planning that obvious? Dad, you've had travel brochures stacked on your desk for 6 months, Sophia pointed out. And Mom's been talking about learning Portuguese and taking photography classes. It doesn't take detective skills to figure out that you're planning something big. As the evening wound down and the celebration gradually dispersed, Marcus and Elena found themselves alone on the rooftop garden, surrounded by the evidence of everything they had built together, not just the organizations and programs and policy changes, but the family they had created and the community of leaders they had nurtured. So, Elena said, leaning against the railing and looking out over the city that had become their canvas for demonstrating that love and business could work together to create positive change, when do we leave for this grand adventure you're planning? Marcus felt his heart leap with the same excitement he had experienced as a teenager making plans with Elena for a future they couldn't entirely envision but were eager to embrace together. How about we start with Spain in the spring? 6 months of traveling through Europe, then 6 months in Central America looking at community development projects, then maybe a year in Asia exploring different approaches to sustainable development. Elena smiled, the expression transforming. Her face with the kind of joy that Marcus had learned to treasure above any business success or public recognition. "Marcus Rothwell, are you asking me to run away with you?" "Elena Vasquez Rothwell," Marcus replied, using the full name she had taken after their marriage. "I'm asking you to run towards something new with me. I'm asking if you're ready for the next chapter of our adventure together." Elena's kiss was her answer, but she followed it with words that made their commitment to this new phase explicit. "I've been ready since the moment I realized that loving you didn't mean giving up my independence. It meant sharing my dreams with someone who wanted to help me achieve them." As they stood together on the rooftop garden, surrounded by the lights of Charleston and the infinite possibilities of their shared future, both Marcus and Elena understood that their story was entering its most beautiful chapter yet. They had proven that second chances could lead to better endings than anyone dared dream, that love deferred could become love renewed, and that the greatest adventures often began with the simple decision to trust someone else with your heart. The silent Baron had found his voice, and it was saying exactly what Elena had always needed to hear, that their best days were still ahead of them, waiting to be discovered together. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.